now, a way to mask their indifference and their servitude to the status quo. Let me give you an example. In the wake of the United for Peace and Justice collapse, there has been one attempt to fill the gap. A so-called United National Anti-War Conference was held a couple of months ago in Albany, New York, initiated by a group calling itself the National Assembly to End Wars and Occupations, a group identified with a small Trotskyist organization called Socialist Action. And the speakers' lineup read like a who's who of the far left. Noam Chomsky was one of the keynote speakers, and he gave his usual analysis of war as a capitalist plot of some sort. And he also made a point of linking the anti-war perspective to the Palestinian issue, an issue that has proved remarkably divisive in the past. The other keynote speaker was South Carolina AFL-CIO executive Donna DeWitt, who made the dubious case for tying the anti-war issue to every left-wing cause under the sun and then some. She ended her spiel with a plug for the October 25th Democratic Party Get Out the Vote mobilization in Washington, D.C. Among the 700 plus who registered for this conference, not a single conservative or even a moderate could be found. It was yet another case of the left talking to itself and earnestly passing all sorts of resolutions and declarations of solidarity, one of their favorite words, that won't have the slightest effect on external reality. There are also numerous workshops and lectures, and one very interesting debate entitled "The Rise of Right-Wing Populism and the Tea Party. Do we need a left-right coalition?" Now, right then and there, from the very title of this debate, we see the arrogance and sectarianism of the left coming right out in the open, utterly unashamed. Do we really need to debate whether the anti-war movement needs more allies? Why is this even an issue? The anti-war movement, down in the doldrums as it is, needs all the allies it can get. And anyone who questions this elementary proposition is no friend of the anti-war cause. In any case, arguing in the affirmative was Kevin Zeese, my good friend, and the director of Voters for Peace, who gave a clear and cogent case for opening up the anti-war movement to anyone who agrees with its basic precepts, the U.S. out of Iraq and Afghanistan. He pointed out the divisions, the very important divisions among conservatives on the foreign policy question, and asked why not take advantage of these divisions to foster the growth and development of the movement for peace? A good question, which the left sectarians at the conference didn't bother answering. Instead, the speakers opposed to the proposition of an alliance with libertarians such as myself went out of their way to insult and smear anti-interventionists who aren't socialists or so-called progressives, whatever that may mean. The most offensive was Glenn Ford of the Black Agenda Group, who launched into a frothy-mouthed tirade against the Tea Partiers, and indeed anyone to the right of the Democratic Party, as being a so-called white nationalist. He gave no evidence for this serious charge. He simply assumed its truth and seemed to be making the argument from authority. I mean, here is a black man calling somebody a racist, so it must be true. I don't think so. And seemed to be making, well, you really ought to go to YouTube and look up his talk, listen to it. It's remarkable for its profound ignorance and offensiveness. If we ally with libertarians, he argued, no black person will join us. The Tea Partiers, he said, are just a bunch of old white racists. That he said this to an audience that was almost exclusively white and mainly over the age of 50 didn't faze him one bit. The other speaker in opposition was one Christine Gavreau, a member of Socialist Action and a prominent figure in the anti-war movement. Her spiel was a classic example of left sectarianism in the service of blatant opportunism. She explicitly attacked libertarian Ron Paul, saying, quote, "He only wants to end war abroad to make war on working people at home," end quote. A phrase that conjures visions of Ron Paul's stormtroopers marauding through the country, cutting down everyone in their path. And this is what she honestly believes, because in her speech, she went on to say that Europe, too, is experiencing a right-wing populist upheaval. And she went on to mention explicitly racist and fascist groups, as if these groups had anything to do with Ron Paul or libertarianism, or indeed anything that's going on in America. This is the kind of argument made by those who really have no argument to make. It is a smear, pure and simple. The idea that libertarians are the vanguard of some new fascist movement is simply too absurd to even refute. Ron Paul has been up there in Washington voting against the Patriot Act, the war budgets, and all the rest, virtually alone, far more consistently than anyone, and has certainly been more of a voice against our foreign policy of global intervention than any single member of Congress. It's almost comical if you like your humor on the dark side. Well, I won't go on about that. I will simply note that we've had an election in which the Tea Partiers showed that this is very far from the case. They are not a small minority. After toppling the Republican establishment, they went on to win elections across the country. These people, many of them, are ordinary working class folks. They aren't rich, they aren't plutocrats, nor is their movement the pawn of powerful billionaires working behind the scenes, as the mainstream media would have us believe. They are people who are quite simply fed up with government and all of its works. And one of those works is war. Now, I don't believe the majority of Tea Partiers are aware of the connections between big government and empire. Outside of Ron Paul's sizable contingent of admirers, most of the Tea Partiers are completely focused on domestic spending, and foreign policy is something they know very little about, so it is outside of their purview. But why not reach out to these people with the anti-war message? Why not point out to them that we spend, as Richard pointed out, more on the military than all other nations on earth combined? I mean, think about that. The aim of the anti-war movement should be to reach out and convince the American people in their majority. And after our recent elections, I don't think there's any question that Americans in their majority are quite conservative. To not try to convince them in their own terms that our current foreign policy is dangerous and counterproductive would be, in my estimate, a crime, a moral crime, because it is all well and good to get up on a soapbox and spew left-sounding rhetoric, but to know that people are actually dying, innocent people, in a faraway land, even as you speak, even as I speak, that should give pause to the most uncompromising leftist ideologue. That should give pause to anyone who wants to narrow the focus of the anti-war movement any more than it is already narrowed. That should make one think twice before rejecting any possible allies in an effort to stop killing.